Hey, looks like I'm live. Hello. Sorry, at the last minute, I was trying to forward an email from my landlord to my friend who has a printer who could print it so I could sign it and scan it, but I can't find the attachment anymore, so I just emailed him and asked him to send it again. I'm a boomer now. I don't know how to do email. I'm an idiot. Right. I'm going to find my place and also send a tweet saying that I am actually live. We're here, hooray. I'm laughing about DBS. God, he's so fucking great. Honestly, one of the funniest and personally best dudes on the website. Maybe any website. Hi, Julie. Hi. Do they let you listen to me at work? I will tone down my language. I mean, I won't, but I'll try and remember to tone down my language. There's not a lot of light getting diffused onto me. That's probably enough, though. It's a very bright, sunny day outside. Oh, your headphones is cool. Right. That's the good thing about headphones is that they always fall out when you're listening to something really embarrassing. Or actually, maybe that's just because I'm always listening to something embarrassing. Right, so Dreams in the Witch House. I'm just trying to find my place. I'm reading it from the H.P. Lovecraft Archive online. Whatever it's called, I can't remember. He's moved into this house. It's a witch house. There are weird angles because Lovecraft was afraid of geometry, as we all are. Also, other people who live in that house are Polish. Therefore, they have the minds of children and are very stupid and superstitious. Because Lovecraft just couldn't help himself, really. Right, so he has been having some very weird dreams about this woman, Keziah Mason, who was a witch, and well, she was put on trial for witchcraft in 1692, the Salem year, and she vanished strangely, and now he is having dreams about vanishing strangely via the weird mathematics and geometry of his room. Also, Keziah Mason had a horrible little familiar called Brown Jenkin, who is a rat with a human face and human hands. Pretty normal, actually. He is having a strange pull towards a strange place on the ground. And then it's moved to the southwest, and then it's moved to the ceiling. So he's pinned it down that one of the stars is kind of calling to him in some way. Also, he has dreams about the scary witch, and he's also seen a woman who looks like the scary witch down in the slums of the town he's in. Hey, I found it. Right. Right, yes. Right as we leave, as we left off yesterday, or the day before, or whenever it was, Walter Gilman has been confronted by his stupid, childish Polish neighbors about how they were all drunk and stupid and saw a violet light coming from his window. It's really hard to pronounce. Mazurowitz, I think. Sometimes I just call him Joe, even when the text says the full name. I'm sorry, but I'm sure you're all really bad at pronouncing Maori names, so. Right. Yeah, it was the sky, a point among the stars, had a claim on him and was calling him. The morning it was underfoot, afternoon in the southeast. Now it's roughly south, wheeling towards the west. Again mustering his resolution, Gilman turned and dragged himself back to the sinister old house. And we've only got 2 people in the chat, which is fine. Like, I would read if there was only 1, but I'm just worried that people will miss out. Then again, all this shit is public domain, so. Gilman turned, dragged himself back to the sinister old house. Mezerowitz was waiting for him at the door, and seemed both anxious and reluctant to whisper some fresh bit of superstition. It was about the witchlight. Joe had been out celebrating the night before. It was Patriots' Day in Massachusetts, and had come home after midnight. Looking up at the house from the outside, he had thought at first that Gilman's window was dark, but then he had seen the faint violet glow within. He wanted to warn the gentleman about that glow, but everybody in Arkham knew it was Keziah's witchlight, which played near Brown Jenkin and the ghost of the old crone herself. He had not mentioned this before, but now he must tell about it because it meant that Keziah and her long-toothed familiar were haunting the young gentleman. Sometimes he and Paul Choyensky and landlord Dombrowski thought they saw that light seeping out of cracks in the sealed loft above the young gentleman's room, but they had all agreed not to talk about that. However, it would be better for the gentleman to take another room and get a crucifix from some good priest like Father Ivanicki. All these people are Polish, they are all stupid and superstitious in Lovecraft's eyes. Even though they're right, that's absolutely what he should be doing. As the man rambled on, Gilman felt a nameless panic clutch at his throat. He knew that Joe must have been half drunk when he came home the night before. Why? Because he's Polish? Yet this mention of a violet light in the garret window was of frightful import. It was a lambent glow of this sort which always played about the old woman and the small furry thing in those lighter, sharper dreams which prefaced his plunge into unknown abysses. And the thought that a wakeful second person could see the dream luminance was utterly beyond sane harbourage. Yet where had the fellow got such an odd notion? Had he himself talked as well as walked around the house in his sleep? No, Joe said, he had not. But he must check up on this. Perhaps Frank Elwood could tell him something, though he hated to ask. Gilman also believes he's been sleepwalking, because people have looked into his room while he's been out, and while he's been asleep, rather, and they haven't been able to find him. He has no idea that he's probably been disappearing, even though that's what everything here is pointing to. This just won't stay back. Here we go, it's better. Fever, wild dreams, somnambulism, illusions of sounds, a pull toward a point in the sky, and now a suspicion of insane sleep talking. He must stop studying, see a nerve specialist, and take himself in hand. When he climbed to the second story, he paused at Elwood's door, but saw that the other youth was out. Reluctantly, he continued up to his garret room and sat down in the dark. His gaze was still pulled to the southwest, but he also felt himself listening intently for some sound in the closed loft above, and half imagining that an evil violet light seeped down through an infinitesimal crack in the low, slanting ceiling. That night, as Gilman slept, the violet light broke upon him with heightened intensity, and the old witch and small furry thing, getting closer than ever before, mocked him with inhuman squeals and devilish gestures. He was glad to sink into the vaguely roaring twilight abysses, though the pursuit of that iridescent bubble conjuries and the kaleidoscopic little polyhedron was menacing and irritating. Then came the shift, as vast converging planes of a slippery-looking substance loomed above and below him, a shift which ended in a flash of delirium and a blaze of unknown alien light in which yellow, carmine, and indigo were madly and inextricably blended. This all sounds a lot like being on ketamine, to be honest. He was half lying on a high, fantastically balustraded terrace above a boundless jungle of outlandish, incredible peaks, balanced plains, domes, minarets, horizontal discs poised on pinnacles, and numberless forms of still greater wildness, some of stone and some of metal, which glittered gorgeously in the mixed, almost blistering glare from a polychromatic sky. Looking upward, he saw 3 stupendous discs of flame, each of a different hue, and at a different height above an infinitely distant curving horizon of low mountains. Behind him, tiers of higher terraces towered aloft as far as he could see. The city below stretched away to the limits of vision, and he hoped that no sound would well up from it. Welcome to the third person listening. He's still having dreams. The Polish neighbors are still stupid and superstitious. It's Lovecraft. The pavement from which he easily raised himself was of a veined, polished stone beyond his power to identify, and the tiles were cut in bizarre angled shapes which struck him as less asymmetrical than based on some unearthly symmetry whose laws he could not comprehend. The balustrade was chest-high, delicate, and fantastically wrought, while along the rail were ranged at short intervals little figures of grotesque design and exquisite workmanship. They, like the whole balustrade, seemed to be made of some sort of shining metal whose colour could not be guessed in this chaos of mixed effulgences, and their nature utterly defied conjecture. They represented some rigid barrel-shaped object with thin horizontal arms radiating spoke-light from a central ring, and with vertical knobs or bulbs projecting from the head and base of the barrel. Each of these knobs was the hub of a system of 5 long, flat, triangularly tapering arms arranged around it like the arms of a starfish, nearly horizontal, but curving slightly away from the central barrel. The base of the bottom knob was fused to the long railing with so delicate a point of contact that several figures had been broken off and were missing. The figures were about 4.5 inches in height, while the spiky arms gave them a maximum diameter of about 2.5 inches. Hey, how's it going? You're in the witch's house? That's cool. These dreams are very specific. They almost sound like Lovecraft saw some like alien technology. This is Walter Gilman, and he is having dreams in the witch house because an old-timey Salem witch also understood the magic of angles and geometry and using them to move between realms in some way. It's really interesting, all the names that Lovecraft reuses. I think Gilman is like the second middle name of some of his other characters, you know, the Uptons and the Pickmans, the Darbys and the Gilmans. When Gilman stood up, the tiles felt hot to his bare feet. He was wholly alone, and his first act was to walk to the balustrade and look dizzily down at the endless cyclopean city almost 2,000 feet below. As he listened, he thought a rhythmic confusion of faint musical pipings covering a wide tonal range welled up from the narrow streets beneath, and he wished he might discern the denizens of the place. The sight turned him giddy after a while, so that he would have fallen to the pavement had he not clutched instinctively at the lustrous balustrade. His right hand fell on one of the projecting figures, the touch seeming to steady him slightly. It was too much, however, for the exotic delicacy of the metalwork, and the spiky figure snapped off under his grasp. Still half dazed, he continued to clutch it as his other hand seized a vacant space on the smooth railing. But now his oversensitive ears caught something behind him, and he looked back across the level terrace. Approaching him softly, though without apparent furtiveness, were 5 figures, 2 of which were the sinister old woman and the fanged, very little animal. The other 3 were what sent him unconscious, for they were living entities about 8 feet high, shaped precisely like the spiky images on the balustrade, and propelling themselves by a spider-like wriggling of their lower set of starfish arms. Ugh. Gilman awakened in his bed, drenched by a cold perspiration and with a smarting sensation in his face, hands, and feet. Springing to the floor, he washed and dressed in frantic haste, as if it were necessary for him to get out of the house as quickly as possible. He did not know where he wished to go, but felt that once more he would have to sacrifice his classes. That's right, he's at Miskatonic University. Go fight in squid. The odd pull toward that point in the sky between Hydra and Argo had abated, but another of even greater strength had taken its place. Now he felt that he must go north, infinitely north. He decided to cross the bridge that gave a view of the desolate island in the Miskatonic, so went over the Peabody Avenue Bridge. Very often he stumbled, for his eyes and ears were chained to an extremely lofty point in the blank blue sky. After about an hour, he got himself under better control and saw that he was far from the city. All around him stretched the bleak emptiness of salt marshes, while the narrow road ahead led to Innsmouth, that ancient, half-deserted town which Arkham people were so curiously unwilling to visit. Though the northward pull had not diminished, he resisted it as he had that other pull, and finally found that he could almost balance the one against the other. Plodding back to town and getting some coffee at a soda fountain, he dragged himself into the public library and browsed aimlessly among the lighter magazines. Once he met some friends who remarked how oddly sunburned he looked, but he did not tell them of his walk. At 3 o'clock, he took some lunch at a restaurant, noting meanwhile that the pull had either lessened or divided itself. After that, he killed the time at a cheap cinema show, seeing the inane performance over and over again without paying any attention to it. I like to think that he's watching, what was that movie called? Infinite Horse Wars or something. It was great. About 9 at night, he drifted homeward and stumbled into the ancient house. Joe Mazurowitz was whining unintelligible prayers, and Gilman hastened up to his own garret chamber without pausing to see if Elwood was in. It was when he turned on the feeble electric light that the shock came. At once, he saw there was something on the table which did not belong there, and a second look left no room for doubt. Lying on its side, for it could not stand up alone, was the exotic spiky figure which in his monstrous dream he had broken off the fantastic balustrade. No detail was missing. The ridged, barrel-shaped centre, the thin, radiating arms, the knobs at each end, and the flat, slightly outward curving starfish arms spreading from those knobs, all were there. In the electric light, the colour seemed to be kind of iridescent grey veiled with green, and Gilman could see amidst his horror and bewilderment that one of the knobs ended in a jagged break corresponding to its former point of attachment to the dream railing. Yeah, it does sound like he was electrocuted by the light. Every time Lovecraft talks about the Polish neighbours praying, he always used the words whining. His whining prayers. He whined his prayers. I mean, we all know that Lovecraft would have been a Redditor, and I guess it's not really a surprise to know that he's also a teen atheist. Teen atheism brought to you by Diet Coke, which I should really stop drinking. I think it's incredibly bad for me. But I like it. He would have been a Redditor. I don't know if he would have participated much in Red Pill, but he would have loved men going their own way. That would have been perfect for him. And all the racism, obviously. Only his tendency toward a dazed stupor prevented him from screaming aloud. Wow, that's relatable. This fusion of dream and reality was too much to bear. Still dazed, he clutched at the spiky thing and staggered downwards to landlord Dombrowski's quarters. The whining prayers of the superstitious loom fixer were still sounding through the mouldy halls, but Gilman did not mind them now. The landlord was in and greeted him pleasantly. No, he had not seen that thing before and did not know anything about it. But his wife had said she found a funny tin thing in one of the beds when she fixed the rooms at noon, and maybe that was it. Dombrowski called her and she waddled in. Yes, that was the thing. She had found it in the young gentleman's bed, on the side next to the wall. It had looked very queer to her, but of course the young gentleman had lots of queer things in his room. books and curios and pictures and markings on paper. She certainly knew nothing about it. Markings on paper? Does she not know what is? It just sounds like Lovecraft is implying that this woman doesn't actually know what writing is. I'm sure he isn't, but I'm also sure he would have if he'd thought of it. Oh, can't get over this eye cream making it look like I have wrinkles under my eyes. I haven't. Stolen valor of the elderly. So, Gilman climbed upstairs again in a mental turmoil, convinced that he was either still dreaming or that his somnambulism had run to incredible extremes and led him to depredations in unknown places. Where had he got this outre thing? He did not recall seeing it in any museum in Arkham. It must have been somewhere, though, and the sight of it, as he snatched it in his sleep, must have caused the odd dream picture of the balustraded terrace. Next day he would make some very guarded inquiries, and perhaps see the nerve specialist. Nerve specialists are kind of old-timey psychiatrists, I guess. Meanwhile, he would try to keep track of his somnambulism. As he went upstairs and across the garret hall, he sprinkled about some flour which he had borrowed, with a frank admission as to its purpose, from the landlord. He had stopped at Elwood's door on the way, but had found all dark within. Entering his room, he placed the spiky thing on the table and lay down in complete mental and physical exhaustion without pausing to undress. It's also relatable. From the closed loft above the slanting ceiling, he thought he heard a vague scratching and padding, but he was too disorganized even to mind it. That cryptical pull from the north was getting very strong again, though it now seemed to come from a lower place in the sky. In the dazzling violet light of dream, the old woman and the fanged furry thing came again, and with a greater distinctness than on any former occasion. This time they actually reached him, and he felt the crone's withered claws clutching at him. He was pulled out of bed and into empty space, and for a moment he heard the rhythmic roaring and saw the twilight amorphousness of the vague abysses seething around him. But that moment was very brief, for presently he was in a crude, windowless little space with rough beams and planks rising to a peak just above his head, and with a curious slanting floor underfoot. Propped level on that floor were low cases full of books of every degree of antiquity and disintegration, and in the centre were a table and bench, both apparently fastened in place. Small objects of unknown shape and nature were ranged on the tops of the cases, and in the flaming violet light, Gilman thought he saw a counterpart of the spiky image which had puzzled him so horribly. On the left, the floor fell abruptly away, leaving a black triangular gulf out of which, after a second's dry rattling, there presently climbed the hateful little furry thing with the yellow fangs and bearded human face. The evilly grinning beldame still clutched him, and beyond a table stood a figure he had never seen before. A tall, lean man of dead black coloration, but without the slightest sign of African American features. Wholly devoid of either hair or beard, and wearing as his only garment a shapeless robe of some heavy black fabric. His feet were indistinguishable because of the table and bench, but he must have been shod, since there was a clicking whenever he changed position. The man did not speak, and bore no trace of expression in his small, regular features. He merely pointed to a book of prodigious size which lay open on the table, while the beldame thrust a huge grey quill into Gilman's right hand. Over everything was a pall of intensely maddening fear, and the climax was reached when the furry thing ran up the dreamer's clothing to his shoulders and then down his left arm, finally biting him sharply in the wrist just below his cuff. As the blood spurted from this wound, Gilman lapsed into a faint. I obviously edited the word African American. Can't help himself. He waked on the morning of the 22nd with a pain in his left wrist and saw that his cuff was brown with dried blood. His recollections were very confused, but the scene with the black man in the unknown space stood out vividly. The rats must have bitten him as he slept, giving rise to the climax of that frightful dream. Opening the door, he saw that the flour on the corridor floor was undisturbed except for the huge prints of the loutish fellow who roomed at the other end of the garret. So he had not been sleepwalking this time. But something would have to be done about those rats. He would speak to the landlord about them. Again, he tried to stop up the hole at the base of the slanting wall, wedging in a candlestick which seemed of about the right size. His ears were ringing horribly, as if with the residual echoes of some horrible noise heard in dreams. As he bathed and changed clothes, he tried to recall what he had dreamed after the scene in the violet lit-in space, but nothing definite would crystallize in his mind. That scene itself must have corresponded to the sealed loft overhead, which had begun to attack his imagination so violently, but later impressions were faint and hazy. There were suggestions of the vague twilight abysses, and of still vaster, blacker abysses beyond them, abysses in which all fixed suggestions of form were absent. He had been taken there by the bubble conjuries and the little polyhedron which always dogged him, but they, like himself, had changed to wisps of milky, barely luminous mist in this farther void of ultimate blackness. Something else had gone on ahead, a larger wisp, which now and then condensed into nameless approximations of form, and he thought that their progress had not been in a straight line, but rather along the alien curves and spirals of some ethereal vortex which obeyed laws unknown to the physics and mathematics of any conceivable cosmos. Eventually, there had been a hint of vast, leaping shadows, of a monstrous, half-acoustic pulsing, and of the thin, monotonous piping of an unseen flute. But that was all. Gilman decided he had picked up that last conception from what he had read in the Necronomicon about the mindless entity Azathoth, which rules all time and space from a curiously environed black throne at the center of chaos. When the blood was washed away, the wrist wound proved very slight, and Gilman puzzled over the location of the two tiny punctures. It occurred to him that there was no blood on the bedspread where he had lain, which was very curious in view of the amount on his skin and cuff. Had he been sleepwalking within his room, and had the rat bitten him as he sat in some chair or paused in some less rational position? He looked in every corner for brownish drops or stains, but did not find any. He had better, he thought, sprinkle flour within the room as well as outside the door, though after all, no further proof of his sleepwalking was needed. He knew he did walk, and the thing to do now was to stop it. He must ask Frank Elwood for help. This morning the strange pulls from space seemed lessened, though they were replaced by another sensation even more inexplicable. It was a vague, insistent impulse to fly away from his present situation, but held not a hint of a specific direction in which he wished to fly. As he picked up the strange spiky image on the table, he thought the older northward pull grew a trifle stronger, but even so, it was wholly overruled by the newer and more bewildering urge. He took the spiky image down to Elwood's room, steeling himself against the whines of the loom fixer which welled up from the ground floor, excuse me. Whining. All the time. Elwood was in, thank heaven, and appeared to be stirring about. It was time for a little conversation before leaving for breakfast in college, so Gilman hurriedly poured forth an account of his recent dreams and fears. His host was very sympathetic, and agreed that something ought to be done. He was shocked by his guest's drawn, haggard aspect, and noticed the queer, abnormal-looking sunburn which others had remarked during the past week. There was not much, though, that he could say. He had not seen Gilman on any sleepwalking expedition, and had no idea what the curious image could be. He had, though, heard the French-Canadian who lodged just under Gilman talking to Mazurowitz one evening. They were telling each other how badly they dreaded the coming of Alpagus night, now only a few days off, and were exchanging pitying comments about the poor doomed young gentleman. Desrochers, the fellow under Gilman's room, had spoken of nocturnal footsteps, both shod and unshod, and of the violet light he saw one night when he had stolen fearfully up to peer through Gilman's keyhole. He had not dared to peer, he told Mazurowitz, after he had glimpsed that light through the cracks around the door. There had been a soft talking, too, and as he began to describe it, his voice had sunk to an inaudible whisper. French Canadians are also stupid and superstitious. That's That's a kind of racism I haven't encountered before. Pretty cool. Always very exciting to learn a new racism. Elwood could not imagine what had set these superstitious creatures gossiping, but suppose their imaginations had been roused by Gilman's late hours and somnolent walking and talking on the one hand, and by the nearness of traditionally feared May Eve on the other hand. That Gilman talked in his sleep was plain, and it was obviously from Desrochers' keyhole listenings that the delusive notion of the violet dreamlight had got abroad. These simple people were quick to imagine they had seen any odd thing they had heard about. As for a plan of action, Gilman had better move down to Elwood's room and avoid sleeping alone. Elwood would, if awake, rouse him whenever he began to talk or rise in his sleep. Very soon, too, he must see the specialist. Meanwhile, they would take the spiky image around to the various museums and to certain professors, seeking identification and stating that it had been found in a public rubbish can. Also, Dombrowski must attend to the poisoning of those rats in the walls. It's kind of funny that, yeah, Lovecraft thinks these French Canadians and Polish people are so very stupid. But Gilman just, he just keeps sleeping in the most haunted room in the world and, picking up artifacts that he brought back with him from a dream. He's not putting anything together. Yep, rats in the walls all the time. Only one of them has little human hands and a little human face, but they're all still rats in the walls. Braced up by Elwood's companionship, Gilman attended classes that day. Strange urges still tugged at him, but he could sidetrack them with considerable success. I'm not even going to make a joke about strange urges. It's funny on its own. During a free period, he showed the queer image to several professors, all of whom were intensely interested, though none of them could shed any light upon its nature or origin. That night he slept on a couch which Elwood had had the landlord bring to the second-story room, and for the first time in weeks was wholly free from disquieting dreams. But the feverishness still hung on, and the whines of the loom fixer were an unnerving influence. Whining. During the next few days, Gilman enjoyed an almost perfect immunity from morbid manifestations. Nice for some. He had, Elwood said, showed no tendency to talk or rise in his sleep, and meanwhile the landlord was putting rat poison everywhere. The only disturbing element was the talk among the superstitious foreigners, whose imaginations had become highly excited. Mezurowitz was always trying to make him get a crucifix, and finally forced one upon him, which he said had been blessed by the good Father Ivanicki. Desrochers, too, had something to say. In fact, he insisted that cautious steps had sounded in the now vacant room above him on the first and second nights of Gilman's absence from it. Paul Choyensky thought he heard sounds in the halls and on the stairs at night, and claimed that his door had been softly tried, while Mrs. Dombrowski vowed she had seen Brown Jenkin for the first time since All Hallows. But such naive reports could mean very little, and Gilman let the cheap metal crucifix hang idly from a knob on his host's dresser. Yep, he's a smarty. He's a clever boy. For 3 days, Gilman and Elwood canvassed the local museums in an effort to identify the strange, spiky image, but always without success. In every quarter, however, interest was intense, for the utter alienage of the thing was a tremendous challenge to scientific curiosity. One of the small radiating arms was broken off and subjected to chemical analysis, and the result is still talked about in college circles. Professor Ellery found platinum, iron, and tellurium in the strange alloy, but mixed with these were at least 3 other apparent elements of high atomic weight, which chemistry was absolutely powerless to classify. Not only did they fail to correspond with any known element, but they did not even fit the vacant places reserved for probable elements in the periodic system. The mystery remains unsolved to this day, though the image is on exhibition at the Museum of Miskatonic University. On the morning of April 27th, a fresh rat hole appeared in the room where Gilman was a guest, but Dombrowski tinned it up during the day. The poison was not having much effect. The scratchings and scurryings in the walls were virtually undiminished. Elwood was out late that night, and Gilman waited up for him. He did not wish to go to sleep in a room alone, especially since he thought he'd glimpsed in the evening twilight the repellent old woman whose image had become so horribly transferred to his dreams. He wondered who she was, and what had been near her rattling the tin can in a rubbish heap at the mouth of a squalid courtyard. The crone had seemed to notice him and leer evilly at him, though perhaps this was merely his imagination. Next day, both youths felt very tired, and knew they would sleep like logs when night came. In the evening, they drowsily discussed the mathematical studies which had so completely and perhaps harmfully engrossed Gilman, and speculated about the linkage with ancient magic and folklore which seemed so darkly probable. They spoke of old Keziah Mason, and Elwood agreed that Gilman had good scientific grounds for thinking she might have stumbled on strange and significant information. The hidden cults to which these witches belonged often guarded and handed down surprising secrets from elder, forgotten eons, and it was by no means impossible that Keziah had actually mastered the art of passing through dimensional gates. Tradition emphasizes the uselessness of material barriers in halting a witch's motions, and who can say what underlies the old tales of broomstick rides through the night? Whether a modern student could ever gain similar powers from mathematical research alone was still to be seen. Success, Gilman added, might lead to dangerous and unthinkable situations, for who could foretell the conditions pervading an adjacent but normally inaccessible dimension? On the other hand, the picturesque possibilities were enormous. Time could not exist in certain belts of space, and by entering and remaining in such a belt, one might preserve one's life and age indefinitely, never suffering organic metabolism or deterioration, except for slight amounts incurred during visits to one's own or similar planes. One might, for example, pass into a timeless dimension and emerge at some remote period of the Earth's history as young as before. I don't really think it would be worth it. There'd be nothing to do in the other dimension. You'd just be there, not aging and not getting to watch prestige television. So, hell would be the point? Whether anybody had ever managed to do this, one could hardly conjecture with any degree of authority. Old legends are hazy and ambiguous, and in historic times, all attempts at crossing forbidden gaps seemed complicated by strange and terrible alliances with beings and messengers from outside. There was the immemorial figure of the deputy or messenger of hidden and terrible powers, the black man of the witch cult, and the Nyarlathotep of the Necronomicon. There was, too, the baffling problem of the lesser messengers or intermediaries, the quasi-animals and queer hybrids which legend depicts as witches' familiars. As Gilman and Elwood retired, too sleepy to argue further, they heard Joe Mazurowitz reel into the house half drunk and shuddered at the desperate wildness of his whining prayers. Pretty cool reference here to Margaret Murray, who wrote The Witch Cult in Western Europe, which is an absolutely bonkers book based on essentially nothing about, she wrote it in like the 20s or something, and it's about how like witches these days are all descended from, ancient pagan superstitions, and how there are actually secret witches everywhere through history. If you look, like the kings and queens of England, Joan of Arc, Gilles de Rais, the legendary Bluebeard who killed thousands of children and went mental. William Rufus, the King of England, was not killed by accident while hunting. He was, in fact, sacrificed as part of a witch cult. It's really crazy, and it's very fun to think about, but it's just, I know, right? Joan of Arc would be very disappointed in being called a witch, I think, as she was in real life. But yeah, it's It's like a fun alternate history thing. It's definitely not real history. Margaret Murray's been incredibly discredited. But yeah, if she'd written a bunch of novels positing that kind of thing, that would have been fun. Anyway, and as I said last time, the black man they're referring to as the man in black or the devil. They're not. This time it isn't a racist thing. That night, Gilman saw the violet light again. In his dream, he had heard a scratching and gnawing in the partitions and thought that someone fumbled clumsily at the latch. Then he saw the old woman and the small furry thing advancing toward him over the carpeted floor. The beldame's face was alight with inhuman exultation, and the little yellow-toothed morbidity tittered mockingly as it pointed at the heavily sleeping form of Elwood on the other couch across the room. A paralysis of fear stifled all attempts to cry out. As once before, the hideous crone seized Gilman by the shoulders, yanking him out of bed and into empty space. Again, the infinitude of the shrieking twilight abysses flashed past him. But in another second, he thought he was in a dark, muddy, unknown alley of fetid odours, with the rotting walls of ancient houses towering up on every hand. Ahead was the robed black man he had seen in the peaked space in the other dream, while from a lesser distance the old woman was beckoning and grimacing imperiously. Brown Jenkin was rubbing itself with a kind of affectionate playfulness around the ankles of the black man, which the deep mud largely concealed. There was a dark open doorway on the right, to which the black man suddenly pointed. Into this the grimacing crone started, dragging Gilman after her by his pyjama sleeve. There were evil-smelling staircases which creaked ominously, and on which the old woman seemed to radiate a faint violet light, and finally a door leading off a landing. The crone fumbled with the latch and pushed the door open, motioning to Gilman to wait, and disappearing inside the black aperture. The youth's oversensitive ears caught a hideous strangled cry, and presently the beldame came out of the room bearing a small, senseless form which she thrust at the dreamer as if ordering him to carry it. The sight of this form, and the expression on its face, broke the spell. Still too dazed to cry out, he plunged recklessly down the noisome staircase and into the mud outside, halting only when seized and choked by the waiting black man. As consciousness departed, he heard the faint, shrill tittering of the fanged, rat-like abnormality. Beldame means an old woman. I don't know if I said that last time. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean an old woman, but that's kind of the usage we have. On the morning of the 29th, Gilman awaked into a maelstrom of horror. The instant he opened his eyes, he knew something was terribly wrong, for he was back in his old garret room with the slanting wall and ceiling, sprawled on the now unmade bed. His throat was aching inexplicably, and as he struggled to a sitting posture, he saw with growing fright that his feet and pyjama bottoms were brown with caked mud. For the moment, his recollections were hopelessly hazy, but he knew at least that he must have been sleepwalking. Elwood had been lost too deeply in slumber to hear and stop him. On the floor were confused, muddy prints, but oddly enough, they did not extend all the way to the door. The more Gilman looked at them, the more peculiar they seemed, for in addition to those he could recognize as his, there were some smaller, almost round markings, such as the legs of a large chair or table might make, except that most of them tended to be divided into halves. There were also some curious muddy rat tracks leading out of a fresh hole and back into it again. Utter bewilderment and the fear of madness racked Gilman as he staggered to the door and saw that there were no muddy prints outside. The more he remembered of his hideous dream, the more terrified he felt, and it added to his desperation to hear Joe Mazurowitz chanting mournfully 2 floors below. For once the Polish man is not whining while he prays. It's progress. Descending to Elwood's room, he roused his still sleeping host and began telling of how he had found himself, but Elwood could form no idea of what might really have happened. Where Gilman could have been, how he got back to his room without making tracks in the hall, and how the muddy, furniture-like prints came to be mixed with his in the garret chamber were wholly beyond conjecture. Then there were those dark, livid marks on his throat, as if he had tried to strangle himself. He put his hands up to them, but found that they did not even approximately fit. While they were talking, Déruchette dropped in to say that he had heard a terrific clattering overhead in the dark small hours. No, there had been no one on the stairs after midnight, though just before midnight he had heard faint footfalls in the garret and cautiously descending steps he did not like. It was, he added, a very bad time of year for Arkham. The young gentleman had better be sure to wear the crucifix Joe Mazurowitz had given him. Even the daytime was not safe, for after dawn there had been strange sounds in the house, especially a thin, childish wail hastily choked off. Gilman mechanically attended classes that morning, but was wholly unable to fix his mind on his studies. A mood of hideous apprehension and expectancy had seized him, and he seemed to be awaiting the fall of some annihilating blow. At noon he lunched at the university spa, picking up a paper from the next seat as he waited for dessert. But he never ate that dessert, for an item on the paper's first page left him limp, wild-eyed, and able only to pay his check and stagger back to Elwood's room. Alessandra! Ciao, Bella! Hey! He's, Walter Gilman is kind of working out that he may not be sleepwalking. He may be going to alternate dimensions. We're trying. Yes, he's just read a paper and freaked out so badly he didn't eat his dessert, which is the worst thing possible. Oh, and there's a new racism as well against French Canadians, who are apparently also simple and childish and superstitious, like the Polish people living in his house that Lovecraft already mentioned. So that's fun. That's exciting. And this is what he read in the paper. I know, he can't help himself. Lovecraft. There had been a strange kidnapping the night before in Orne's gangway, and the 2-year-old child of a clod-like laundry worker named Anastasia Voleko had completely vanished from sight. I don't have to call her clod-like, Jesus. The mother, it appeared, had feared the event for some time, but the reasons she assigned for her fear were so grotesque that no one took them seriously. She had, she said, seen Brown Jenkin about the place now and then ever since early in March, and knew from its grimaces and titterings that little Ladislas must be marked for sacrifice at the awful Sabbat on Valpurgis night. She had asked her neighbour, Mary Kazanek, to sleep in the room and try to protect the child, but Mary had not dared. She could not tell the police, for they never believed such things. Children had been taken that way every year ever since she could remember, and her friend, Pete Stowacki, could not help because he wanted the child out of the way anyhow. Oh, so many names I can't pronounce. But what threw Gilman into a cold perspiration was the report of a pair of revellers who had been walking past the mouth of the gangway just after midnight. They admitted they had been drunk, but both vowed they had seen a crazily dressed trio furtively entering the dark passageway. There had, they said, been a huge robed African-American gentleman, a little old woman in rags, and a young white man in his nightclothes. The old woman had been dragging the youth, while around the feet of the African-American man, a tame rat was rubbing and weaving in the brown mud. Lovecraft. Gilman sat in a daze all the afternoon, and Elwood, who had meanwhile seen the papers and formed terrible conjectures from them, found him thus when he came home. This time neither could doubt but that something hideously serious was closing in around them. Between the phantasms of nightmare and the realities of the objective world, a monstrous and unthinkable relationship was crystallizing, and only stupendous vigilance could avert still more direful developments. Gilman must see a specialist sooner or later, but not just now, when all the papers were full of this kidnapping business. Just what had really happened was maddeningly obscure, and for a moment both Gilman and Elwood exchanged whispered theories of the wildest kind. No, there's an unthinkable relationship between reality and horrible nightmares. Although I'm sure all relationships were unthinkable to Lovecraft. Can't believe he was married. Insane. Had Gilman unconsciously succeeded better than he knew in his studies of space and its dimensions? Had he actually slipped outside our sphere to points unguessed and unimaginable? Where, if anywhere, had he been on those nights of demoniac alienage? The roaring twilight abysses, the green hillside, the blistering terrace, the pulls from the stars, the ultimate black vortex, the black man, the muddy alley and the stairs, the old witch and the fanged furry horror, the bubble conjuries and the little polyhedron, the strange sunburn, the wrist wound, the unexplained image, the muddy feet, the tooth marks, the tales and fears of the superstitious foreigners. What did all this mean? To what extent could the laws of sanity apply to such a case? Demonic alienage. Alienage is a good word. It's not a word, but it's quite a good one. Yeah, exactly. There was no sleep for either of them that night, but the next day they both cut classes and drowsed. This was April 30th, and with the dusk would come the hellish Sabbath time which all the foreigners and the superstitious old folk feared. Mazurowitz came home at 6 o'clock and said people at the mill were whispering that the Walpurgis revels would be held in the dark ravine beyond Meadow Hill, where the old white stone stands in a place queerly void of all plant life. Some of them had even told the police and advised them to look there for the missing Vallejo child, but they did not believe anything would be done. Joe insisted the poor young gentleman wear his nickel-chained crucifix, and Gilman put it on and dropped it inside his shirt to humour the fellow. He hasn't even tried wearing the crucifix before. I mean, I don't think it would stop any Lovecraftian entities, but he hasn't tried it. Yeah, it's white people snitching, exactly. Foreigners are stupid and superstitious. Old people are also stupid. No, I didn't say nipple chains. I said nickel, like the metal. But that is really funny if he wasn't wearing it because it was. I mean, look, I'm trying to keep you safe from this evil witch, so would you please just take this crucifix on a nipple chain? It's not that big a deal. I think Lovecraft would freak out if he heard about nipple piercing. I don't think he would like the idea. Can't stop thinking about it now. Right. Oh, and Alessandra, when they're talking about the black man, they don't mean a black guy. They're talking about this man he looks like a white dude, but all his skin is a completely obsidian black. Lovecraft's already pointed out that it is not some black guy. It is it's the devil, pretty much. A nipple chain crucifix. That's what I'm going to be thinking about when I'm reading Dracula as well. Jonathan Harker carefully putting a crucifix on his nipple chain. Hello to whoever just joined us. We're having a very good discussion. Yeah, it's Justin Trudeau. Yep. He slipped through a terrible angles of dimensions, and he's turned up in the 30s at Miskatonic. Yes, it is a white dude in blackface. It is the most stupid creature known to man. Highly cursed imagery. Late at night. Oh, actually, to whoever's just joined us as well. Hey, XQR. It's April 30th. May Eve is about to strike, and a 2-year-old Polish child has been kidnapped, and the police don't really care. They're going to sacrifice the child on May Eve, apparently. Late at night, the two youths sat drowsing in their chairs. lulled by the rhythmical praying of the loom fixer on the floor below. Actually, he stopped describing the Polish guy who prays all the time as whining. And it would be really interesting if that were a deliberate choice. That, Walter Gilman is not as contemptuous of, Christianity and prayer and stuff as he has been, because now he's in a lot of trouble. I don't think it is, though. It might be. Gilman listened as he nodded, his preternaturally sharpened hearing seeming to strain for some subtle, dreaded murmur beyond the noises in the ancient house. Unwholesome recollections of things in the Necronomicon and the Black Book welled up, and he found himself swaying to infandous rhythms said to pertain to the blackest ceremonies of the Sabbath, and to have an origin outside the time and space we comprehend. Dude, it's just jazz, relax. Presently he realized what he was listening for, the hellish chant of the celebrants in the distant Black Valley. How did he know so much about what they expected? How did he know the time when Nahab and her acolyte were due to bear the brimming bowl which would follow the black cock and the black goat? If you laugh, you're immature. He saw that Elwood had dropped asleep and tried to call out and waken him. Something, however, closed his throat. He was not his own master. Had he signed the black man's book after all? The devil's book. I think he could handle something very gentle on a harpsichord, maybe. Nothing with a particular rhythm. I don't know. Sounds are quite frightening for old Howard. Yeah, like a lullaby, but not one with scary words or imagery, like the baby falling out of the tree. I don't think he'd handle that. I'm just looking to see how much more we've got. It's still pretty good. Yeah, a lullaby, no words, not much rhythm to it. No lack of rhythm either, because that's also quite scary. Yeah, 4 chords. He'd love that. He'd love all the pop songs that are based off Pachelbel's canon. He might not like Skater Boy. I think skating would be quite frightening for Howard. Then his fevered, abnormal hearing caught the distant wind-borne notes. Over miles of hill and field and alley they came, but he recognized them nonetheless. The fires must be lit, and the dancers must be starting in. How could he keep himself from going? What was it that had enmeshed him? Mathematics? Folklore? The house? Old Keziah? Brown Jenkin? And now he saw that there was a fresh rat hole in the wall near his couch. Above the distant chanting and the nearer praying of Joe Mazurowitz came another sound, a stealthy, determined scratching in the partitions. He hoped the electric lights would not go out. Then he saw the fanged, bearded little face in the rat hole, the accursed little face which he at last realized bore such a shocking, mocking resemblance to old Keziah's, and heard the faint fumbling at the door. Lovecraft would be very upset at any ice cream that wasn't. I think Neapolitan might upset him. He wouldn't be able to handle the ice cream of today. The screaming twilight abysses flashed before him, and he felt himself helpless in the formless grasp of the iridescent bubble congeries. Ahead raced the small kaleidoscopic polyhedron, and all through the churning void there was a heightening and acceleration of the vague tonal pattern which seemed to foreshadow some unutterable and unendurable climax. He seemed to know what was coming, the monstrous burst of Walpurgis rhythm, in whose cosmic timbre would be concentrated all the primal, ultimate space-time seethings which lie behind the massed spheres of matter and sometimes break forth in measured reverberations that penetrate faintly to every layer of entity and give hideous significance throughout the worlds to certain dreaded periods. Hey, what up? It is nearly Walpurgisnacht, and Walter Gilman is afraid that a small kidnapped Polish child is about to be sacrificed. Oh yeah, skateboards would be terrifying for Lovecraft. A mode of locomotion that isn't walking doesn't sound very Anglo-Saxon to me. As Frank Herbert once said, walk without rhythm so you don't scare H.P. Lovecraft. But all this vanished in a second. He was again in the cramped, violet-lit and peaked space with the slanting floor, the low cases of ancient books, the bench and table, the queer objects, and the triangular gulf at one side. Agree. Teens did the knockout game on Lovecraft, and that's how he died. Queer objects. Queer objects for the straight Garrett. Yeah, that's what the story's called now. On the table lay a small white figure, an infant boy, unclothed and unconscious, while on the other side stood the monstrous, leering old woman with a gleaming, grotesque hafted knife in her right hand and a queerly proportioned pale metal bowl covered with curiously chased designs and having delicate lateral handles in her left. Tom of Finland rules. She was intoning some croaking ritual in a language which Gilman could not understand, but which seemed like something guardedly quoted in the Necronomicon. Oh, they're going to sacrifice a Polish child. As the scene grew clear, he saw the ancient crone bend forward and extend the empty bowl across the table. And unable to control his own motions, he reached far forward and took it in both hands, noticing as he did so its comparative lightness. At the same moment, the disgusting form of Brown Jenkins scrambled up over the brink of the triangular black gulf on his left. The crone now motioned him to hold the bowl in a certain position, while she raised the huge, grotesque knife above the small white victim as high as her right hand could reach. The fanged, furry thing began tittering, a continuation of the unknown ritual, while the witch croaked loathsome responses. Gilman felt a gnawing, poignant abhorrence shoot through his mental and emotional paralysis, and the light metal bowl shook in his grasp. A second later, the downward motion of the knife broke the spell completely, and he dropped the bowl with a resounding bell-like clangor while his hands darted out frantically to stop the monstrous deed. Oh yeah, I completely agree. She became old just to annoy people. Yeah, I know. He keeps referring to the Polish baby as white, which is really nice of him. That's very kind. That's very generous of him. In an instant, he had edged up the slanting floor around the end of the table and wrenched the knife from the old woman's claws, sending it clattering over the brink of the narrow triangular gulf. In another instant, however, matters were reversed, for those murderous claws had locked themselves tightly around his own throat, while the wrinkled face was twisted with insane fury. He felt the chain of the cheap crucifix grinding into his neck, and in his peril wondered how the sight of the object itself would affect the evil creature. Her strength was altogether superhuman, but as she continued her choking, he reached feebly in his shirt and drew out the metal symbol, snapping the chain and pulling it free. In light of the earlier discussion we had about nipple piercings, as seen as a lot funnier. At sight of the device, the witch seemed struck with panic, and her grip relaxed long enough to give Gilman a chance to break it entirely. He pulled the steel-like claws from his neck and would have dragged the beldame over the edge of the gulf, had not the claws received a fresh access of strength and closed in again. This time he resolved to reply in kind, and his own hands reached out for the creature's throat. Before she saw what he was doing, he had the chain of the crucifix twisted about her neck, and a moment later he had tightened it enough to cut off her breath. During her last struggle, he felt something bite at his ankle and saw that Brown Jenkins had come to her aid. With one savage kick, he sent the morbidity over the edge of the gulf and heard it whimper on some level far below. Whether he had killed the ancient crone, he did not know, but he let her rest on the floor where she had fallen. Then, as he turned away, He saw on the table a sight which nearly snapped the last thread of his reason. Brown Jenkin, tough of sinew and with 4 tiny hands of demoniac dexterity, had been busy while the witch was throttling him, and his efforts had been in vain. What he had prevented the knife from doing to the victim's chest, the yellow fangs of the furry blasphemy had done to her wrist, and the bowl so lately on the floor stood full beside the small, lifeless body. Oh, that is very sad. Brown Jenkin, how could you? Although now I realize that Brown Jenkin has a human face and little human hands on his front paws and his back paws, which actually tips it over into, from kind of funny in a Pixar way to, ugh. I get why he's the bad guy now. Also, he killed a small Polish child. Yeah, Brown Jenkin is Mayor Pete. The man in black is Justin Trudeau. It's all the Polish child is democracy. Oh my god, that is what a raccoon is. Oh, ew, ew, ew. Sorry, let's get back. It's the exciting bit. In his dream delirium, Gilman heard the hellish alien rhythm chant of the Sabbath coming from an infinite distance, and knew the black man must be there. Confused memories mixed themselves with his mathematics, and he believed his subconscious mind held the angles which he needed to guide him back to the normal world, alone and unaided for the first time. He felt sure he was in the immemorially sealed loft above his own room, but whether he could ever escape through the slanting floor or the long-stopped egress he doubted greatly. Besides, would not an escape from a dream loft bring him merely into a dream house, an abnormal projection of the actual place he sought? He was wholly bewildered as the relation betwixt dream and reality in all his experiences. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can't call everybody human, that's insane. The passage through the vague abysses would be frightful, for the Valpurgis rhythm would be vibrating, and at last he would have to hear that hitherto veiled cosmic pulsing which he so mortally dreaded. Even now he could detect a low, monstrous shaking, whose tempo he suspected all too well. At Sabbath time, it always mounted and reached through the worlds to summon the initiate to nameless rites. Half the chants of the Sabbath were patterned on this faintly overheard pulsing, which no earthly ear could endure in its unveiled spatial fullness. Gilman wondered too whether he could trust his instinct to take him back to the right part of space. How could he be sure he would not land on that green-litten hillside of a far planet, on the tessellated terrace above the city of tentacled monsters somewhere beyond the galaxy, or in the spiral black vortices of that ultimate void of chaos, wherein reigns the mindless demon Sultan Azathoth? He was a small-minded and scaredy trashman. Also, calling Azathoth a Sultan is a really nice, just throwing that in there. I haven't really had a dig at sultans for a little while. It's all been about Polish people and French Canadians. Just before he made the plunge, the violet light went out and left him in utter blackness. The witch, old Keziah, Nahab, that must have meant her death. And mixed with the distant chant of the Sabbath and the whimpers of Brown Jenkin in the gulf below, he thought he heard another and wilder whine from unknown depths. Joe Mazurowitz, the prayers against the crawling chaos now turning to an inexplicably triumphant shriek, words of sardonic actuality impinging on vortices of febrile dream. Ea, Shub Nigurat, the goat with 1,000 young. They found Gilman on the floor of his queerly angled old garret room long before dawn, for the terrible cry had brought Desrochers and Choinsky and Dombrowski and Mazurowitz at once, and had even wakened the soundly sleeping Elwood in his chair. I just want to write out the exact thing which I just said, because it didn't sound like a good word. I'm sure all my Cthulhu people, Lovecraft fans, know what that is, but that is what I wrote out. Didn't sound nice. He was alive. Gilman was alive and with open, staring eyes, but seemed largely unconscious. On his throat were the marks of murderous hands, and on his left ankle was a distressing rat bite. His clothing was badly rumpled, and Joe's crucifix was missing. Elwood trembled, afraid even to speculate on what new form his friend's sleepwalking had taken. Mazurowitz seemed half dazed because of a sign he said he had had in response to his prayers, and he crossed himself frantically when the squealing and whimpering of a rat sounded from beyond the slanting partition. When the dreamer was settled on his couch in Elwood's room, they sent for Dr. Mikowski, a local practitioner who would repeat no tales which they might prove embarrassing, and he gave Gilman 2 hypodermic injections, which caused him to relax in something like natural drowsiness. During the day, the patient regained consciousness at times and whispered his newest dream disjointedly to Elwood. It was a painful process, and at its very start brought out a fresh and disconcerting fact. Gilman, whose ears had so lately possessed an abnormal sensitiveness, was now stone deaf. Dr. Mikowski, summoned again in haste, told Elwood that both eardrums were ruptured, as if by the impact of some stupendous sound, intense beyond all human conception or endurance. How such a sound could have been heard in the last few hours without arousing all the Miskatonic Valley was more than the honest physician could say. Oh, yeah. I mean, Polish people, they all stick together in their superstition, and they all have doctors who also believe in magic. Lovecraft just wanted to add one extra Polish character. I don't know why. Maybe someone wronged him. I mean, I know why it's racism. I'm just wondering why specifically the Polish at this point. Elwood wrote his part of the colloquy on paper so that a fairly easy communication was maintained. Neither knew what to make of the whole chaotic business and decided it would be better if they thought as little possible about it. Both, though, agreed that they must leave this ancient and accursed house as soon as it could be arranged. Evening papers spoke of a police raid on some curious revelers in a ravine beyond Meadow Hill just before dawn, and mentioned that the white stone there was an object of age-long superstitious regard. Nobody had been caught, but among the scattering fugitives had been glimpsed a huge African-American man. In another column, it was stated that no trace of the missing child Ladislas Wolyeko had been found. The crowning horror came that very night. Elwood would never forget it, and was forced to stay out of college the rest of the term because of the resulting nervous breakdown. He had thought he heard rats in the partitions all the evening, but paid little attention to them. Then, long after both he and Gilman had retired, the atrocious shrieking began. Elwood jumped up, turned on the lights, and rushed over to his guest's couch. The occupant was emitting sounds of veritably inhuman nature, as if racked by some torment beyond description. He was writhing under the bedclothes, and a great red stain was beginning to appear on the blankets. Uh-oh, he's getting his period. Elwood scarcely dared to touch him, but gradually the screaming and writhing subsided. By this time, Dombrowski, Choyensky, Desrochers, Mazurowitz, and the top-floor lodger were all crowding into the doorway, and the landlord had sent his wife back to telephone for Dr. Mikowski. Everybody shrieked when a large, rat-like form suddenly jumped out from beneath the ensanguined bedclothes and scudded across the floor to a fresh open hole close by. When the doctor arrived and began to pull down those frightful covers, Walter Gilman was dead. Yeah, a huge black man. He's the devil. Absolutely. Always, without exception. It would be barbarous to do more than suggest what had killed Gilman. There had been virtually a tunnel through his body. Something had eaten his heart out. Dombrowski, frantic at the failure of his constant rat poisoning efforts, cast aside all thought of his lease, and within a week had moved with all his older lodgers to a dingy but less ancient house in Walnut Street. The worst thing for a while was keeping Joe Mazurowitz quiet. for the brooding loom fixer would never stay sober and was constantly whining and muttering about spectral and terrible things. See, I try not to giggle when when things are funny, but it's difficult. Oh, I know, he's always whining. Like earlier he was whining because he was all scared about kids getting murdered by witches, and now he's just like yeah, Joe Mazurowitz is our drunk Polish uncle who has PTSD from seeing the devil. Yeah, yeah, he saw a rat completely tunnel through his flatmate. It's fine. It's like, oh, okay, is this your first Lovecraftian rodeo? People, I think, need to grow up. I mean, not me, because I don't want to. It seems that on that, oh, this is what gave our drunk Polish uncle PTSD. It seems that on that last hideous night, Joe had stooped to look at the crimson rat tracks which led from Gilman's couch to the nearby hole. The fresh one, indeed. Yeah, he's faking PTSD to get out of a rent bump. Gilman's couch. On the carpet, they were very indistinct, but a piece of open flooring intervened between the carpet's edge and the baseboard. There, Mazurowitz had found something monstrous, or thought he had, for no one else could quite agree with him despite the undeniable queerness of the prints. The tracks on the flooring were certainly vastly unlike the average prints of a rat, but even Choyinski and Desrochers would not admit they were like the prints of 4 tiny human hands. The house was never rented again. As soon as Dombrowski left it, the pall of its final desolation began to descend, for people shunned it both on account of its old reputation and because of the new fetid odour. Perhaps the ex-landlord's rat poison had worked after all, for not long after his departure, the place became a neighbourhood nuisance. Health officials tracked the smell to the closed spaces above and beside the eastern garret room, and agreed that the number of dead rats must be enormous. They decided, however, that it was not worth their while to hew open and disinfect the long sealed spaces, for the feta would soon be over, and the locality was not one which encouraged fastidious standards. Indeed, there were always vague local tales of unexplained stenches upstairs in the witch house just after May Eve at Hallowmas. The neighbours grumblingly acquiesced in the inertia, but the feta nonetheless formed an additional count against the place. Toward the last, the house was condemned as a habitation by the building inspector. Gilman's dreams and their attendant circumstances have never been explained. Elwood, whose thoughts on the entire episode are sometimes almost maddening, came back to college the next autumn and graduated in the following June. He found the spectral gossip of the town much diminished, and it is indeed a fact that, notwithstanding certain reports of a ghostly tittering in the deserted house, which lasted almost as long as that edifice itself, no fresh appearances, either of old Keziah or of Brown Jenkin, have been muttered of since Gilman's death. It is rather fortunate that Elwood was not in Arkham in that later year when certain events abruptly renewed the local whispers about elder horrors. Of course, he heard about the matter afterward and suffered untold torments of black and bewildered speculation, but even that was not as bad as actual nearness and several possible sights would have been. Yeah, yeah, it's about gentrification. It's about how stupid Polish people are, even though all of them, except for the kids, survived and Walter didn't. In March 1931, a gale wrecked the roof and the great chimney of the vacant witch house, so that a chaos of crumbling bricks, blackened moss-grown shingles, and rotting planks and timbers crashed down into the loft and broke through the floor beneath. The whole attic story was choked with debris from above, but no one took the trouble to touch the mess before the inevitable razing of the decrepit structure. That ultimate step came in the following December, and it was when Gilman's old room was cleared out by reluctant, apprehensive workmen that the gossip began. Among the rubbish which had crashed through the ancient slanting ceiling were several things which made the workmen pause and call in the police. Later, the police in turn called in the coroner and several professors from the university. There were bones, badly crushed and splintered, but still clearly recognisable as human, whose manifestly modern date conflicted puzzlingly with the remote period at which their only possible lurking place, the low, slant-floored loft overhead, had supposedly been sealed from all human access. The coroner's physician decided that some belonged to a small child, while certain others, found mixed with shreds of rotten brownish cloth, belonged to a rather undersized, bent female of advanced years. Careful sifting of debris also disclosed many tiny bones of rats caught in the collapse, as well as older rat bones, gnawed by small fangs in a fashion now and then highly productive of controversy and reflection. It's quite sad they pulled the house down. I don't really like that. Other objects found included the mingled fragments of many books and papers, together with the yellowish dust left from the total disintegration of still older books and papers. All, without exception, appeared to deal with black magic in its most advanced and horrible forms. And the evidently recent date of certain items is still a mystery as unsolved as that of the modern human bones. An even greater mystery is the absolute homogeneity of the crabbed, archaic writing found in a wide range of papers whose conditions and watermarks suggest age differences of at least 150 to 200 years. To some, though, the greatest mystery of all is the variety of utterly inexplicable objects whose shapes, materials, types of workmanship, and purposes baffle all conjecture, found scattered amidst the wreckage in evidently diverse states of injury. One of these things, which excited several Miskatonic professors profoundly, is a badly damaged monstrosity, plainly resembling the strange image which Gilman gave to the college museum, save that it is larger, wrought of some peculiar bluish stone instead of metal, and possessed of a singularly angled pedestal with undecipherable hieroglyphics. Yeah, there was an old woman. She was so old, she wasn't attractive to anybody, even Benjamin Franklin, and that was pretty gross. So we think she was probably a witch. And we're just going to pull her whole house down. I'm going to wreck all her shit. Archaeologists and anthropologists are still trying to explain the bizarre designs chased on a crushed bowl of light metal, whose inner side bore ominous brownish stains when found. Foreigners and credulous grandmothers were equally garrulous about the modern nickel crucifix with broken chain mixed in the rubbish, and shiveringly identified by Joe Mazurowitz as that which he had given Paul Gilman many years before. Some believe this crucifix was dragged up to the sealed loft by rats, while others think it might have been on the floor in some corner of Gilman's old room all the time. Still others, including Joe himself, have theories too wild and fantastic for sober credence. When the slanting wall of Gilman's room was torn out, the once sealed triangular space between that partition and the house's north wall was found to contain much less structural debris, even in proportion to its size, than the room itself, though it had a ghastly layer of older materials, which paralyzed the wreckers with horror. In brief, the floor was a veritable ossuary of the bones of small children, some fairly modern, but others extending back in infinite gradations to a period so remote that crumbling was almost complete. On this deep, bony layer rested a knife of great size, obvious antiquity and grotesque, ornate and exotic design, above which the debris was piled. In the midst of this debris, wedged between a fallen plank and a cluster of cemented bricks from the ruined chimney, was an object destined to cause more bafflement, veiled fright, and openly superstitious talk in Arkham than anything else discovered in the haunted and accursed building. This object was the partly crushed skeleton of a huge, diseased rat, whose abnormalities of form are still a topic of debate and source of singular reticence among the members of Miskatonic's Department of Comparative Anatomy. Very little concerning the skeleton has leaked out, but the workmen who found it whisper in shocked tones about the long, brownish hairs with which it was associated. The bones of the tiny paws, it is rumoured, imply prehensile characteristics more typical of a diminutive monkey than of a rat, while the small skull with its savage yellow fangs is of the ultimate anomalousness, appearing from certain angles like a miniature, monstrously degraded parody of a human skull. The workmen crossed themselves in fright when they came upon this blasphemy, but later burned candles of gratitude in St. Stanislaus's church because of the shrill, ghostly tittering they felt they would never hear again. Yeah, exactly. The end. The end of The Dreams in the Witch House by H.P. Lovecraft, where the apparently very stupid Polish guys are the only ones who actually figured out what's been happening this whole time. Even Gilman didn't know. It's all very obvious. Yeah. Yep. Gross little brown Jenkin. I would love to stick around and discuss, but this actually took. I know, the poor house and the poor Polish child. Although it would be dead today if it had survived, so doesn't matter. Yes, I would really like to sit around and discuss this, but this went on for half an hour longer than I had actually planned. So thank you everyone for joining me live. Thank you everybody who is joining me in the future. Thank you everybody who is watching this through some strange angles and witchcraft from the 17th century. Hello. Can you retroactively kind of do something about pollution? Because we would. No, that's too far back. They can't do anything. Okay, thank you everybody. I'm going to go and get ready. I will. Love you too. Yeah, I'm going to go see my psychiatrist. She's going to write a note for me saying I'm still mad, and I'm going to give that to the benefits office. I'm as mad as I am, and no matter. Thank you all very much. The next video we'll be going back to Marjorie Kemp, and the winner of the story that we're going to do after Marjorie Kemp, I think, is Dracula, followed by Wuthering Heights, followed by maybe Frankenstein. Not sure. Right. Thanks, everybody. I hope you all have a good day or evening or wherever you're at. A good 17th century. We don't know. Bye. Bye, bye, bye.